Dog guards lost girl in the forest. What happened next shocks all. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. In the heart of an ancient forest, where sunlight struggled to break through the thick canopy, a young girl wandered aimlessly, her small form dwarfed by the towering trees. She clutched her arms tightly to her chest, the chill of the damp morning air biting at her skin. Her name was Emily, a curious and adventurous soul who had strayed too far from her family during a camping trip the day before. Now, with each passing moment, the dense woods seemed to close in around her, turning familiar sights into a labyrinth of shadows and sound. Hours had passed, though to Emily, it felt like days. The rustle of leaves and distant animal calls became both a comfort and a cause for alarm. She paused to catch her breath, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her small feet heavy with exhaustion. "Mom? Dad?" she called out weakly, her voice barely carrying through the stillness of the forest. The only reply came in the form of the wind whispering through the branches, as though the forest itself were watching her. It was then, in the silence, that a deep growl rumbled from the darkness. Emily froze, her wide eyes darting toward the sound. She could see nothing at first, but her pulse quickened. The sound grew closer, the snapping of twigs echoing like thunder in her ears. Her mind raced as panic began to take hold. What was it? A wolf? A bear? She turned, ready to run, when a massive figure stepped out of the shadows. A dog. Not just any dog, but a German shepherd with a coat the color of autumn leaves and eyes that burned with an intelligent amber glow. The dog's size was staggering, its muscular frame standing tall, imposing, yet there was no malice in its gaze. Instead, it tilted its head as if studying her, ears perked forward in curiosity. Emily stumbled backward, unsure of what to do. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice shaking. But the dog did not advance. Instead, it sat, as though silently reassuring her it meant no harm. Emily blinked in disbelief. She had no idea where it had come from or why it was here, but somehow she felt a sliver of comfort seeing those calm, steady eyes looking at her. "Do you live here?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the silence. The dog didn't answer, of course, but it rose to its feet and took a step closer, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Something about the dog's presence was soothing. Emily no longer felt quite so alone. She took a hesitant step forward, and to her surprise, the dog turned and began to walk ahead, looking back at her as if to say, "Follow me." She hesitated, unsure of what to do, but her instincts told her to trust this strange companion. After all, she was lost, and the dog somehow seemed to know where it was going. "Wait for me," Emily called, her small legs carrying her after the dog. It led her deeper into the woods, its confident pace unwavering as it navigated paths that were invisible to her eyes. The forest grew darker as they walked, the sunlight above swallowed by the ever-thickening canopy. Emily's mind wandered. Where was it taking her? Was she being led somewhere safe or deeper into the unknown? But the dog would pause every few minutes, looking back at her with that same calm, steady gaze, and she knew she could trust it. They came to a small clearing where the sunlight broke through, painting the earth with golden light. Emily fell to her knees, breathless and tired. The dog circled her briefly before sitting by her side, watching the perimeter of the clearing as though guarding her. "Are you protecting me?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with awe. The dog's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, but it remained silent. Minutes turned into hours as the pair sat together. Emily leaned against the dog's warm side, the exhaustion finally taking its toll. As her eyelids drooped, she whispered, "Thank you for staying with me." The dog's ears flicked again, but it made no move to leave. It remained a vigilant sentinel, its sharp eyes scanning the woods as the girl drifted off into a deep sleep. The forest grew quieter as the sun arched lower in the sky, its golden rays painting the tops of the trees with a warm glow. Emily slept soundly, her small form rising and falling with gentle breaths as the dog stayed close, a steadfast guardian. Its amber eyes flickered to the shifting shadows on the edge of the clearing, ears twitching at every rustle. This was no ordinary dog. There was something almost otherworldly about its quiet strength and unwavering vigilance. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Emily stirred. She blinked against the fading light, disoriented, until her eyes fell upon the dog curled protectively beside her. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the memory of her being lost came flooding back, and fear crept into her chest. But the dog nudged her gently with its muzzle, snapping her out of it. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice soft and sleepy. The dog gave a low, reassuring rumble and stood, its stance commanding as it looked toward the darkening woods. Emily understood night was coming, and they couldn't stay here. "Where are we going?" she asked as she scrambled to her feet, clutching her torn sweater for warmth. The dog didn't answer, of course, but it turned sharply and began walking again, its strong form cutting confidently through the underbrush. Emily followed without hesitation now. Somehow this dog was her lifeline, and even though she didn't know where it was leading her, she trusted it completely. The forest transformed as darkness fell. The towering trees seemed to loom taller, their shadows stretching like claws. Strange sounds echoed in the distance, unfamiliar cries and distant howls that sent shivers down Emily's spine. "Are there animals out there?" she whispered nervously. The dog glanced back at her, its gaze steady, then moved closer to her side. Its massive form offered her a sense of safety as they pressed forward. Emily reached out to touch its fur as they walked, feeling the warmth radiating from its body. It made her feel less afraid, as though the darkness itself couldn't touch her with this loyal creature at her side. Suddenly, the dog halted, its ears standing tall as it sniffed the air. Emily froze, clutching her chest as her heart raced. "What is it?" she whispered. The dog growled softly, a deep and warning sound that rumbled through the silence. Emily's eyes darted around, trying to see what the dog had sensed, but all she could make out were shadows. Then she heard it, a snapping branch. It was close. Her breath caught in her throat as a low growl answered the dog's, deeper and more threatening. Emily's eyes went wide as the sound grew louder, and something began moving in the brush. The dog stepped in front of her, its fur bristling and teeth bared in a terrifying snarl. Emily clung to the back of the dog, squeezing her eyes shut as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Please no," she whimpered. A moment later, there was silence. Emily opened her eyes cautiously, her vision blurred with tears. The forest was still again. The dog turned its head to look back at her, its steady gaze reassuring. Whatever had been lurking in the woods was gone. Emily fell to her knees, her body shaking as she cried in relief. You scared it away," she whispered through choked sobs. The dog moved closer, pressing its head against her shoulder, and she buried her face in its fur. It stayed there, letting her cry, as though it understood that she needed this moment. Finally, Emily wiped her tears and stood again, her determination returning. "Okay," she said shakily. "Let's keep going." The dog led her once more, and Emily followed with newfound resolve. Though the forest was dark, she no longer felt alone. The dog was her protector, and it seemed to know exactly what it was doing. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin. Emily's heart leapt as she saw a faint light ahead. Is that a road?" she breathed. The dog trotted ahead, its ears still perked and alert, and Emily ran after it, her small feet stumbling as she pushed toward the light. Finally, they broke through the last of the trees, and Emily stumbled onto a gravel path. The headlights of a car appeared in the distance, and her heart raced. "Hey, over here," she shouted, waving her arms frantically. The car slowed to a stop, and a man jumped out, his face pale with shock. "Oh my God, Emily? Is that you?" he cried. Emily's eyes widened as she recognized the voice. It was one of the rangers who had been searching for her. "I'm here," she sobbed, running toward him. The ranger knelt and pulled her into his arms. "We've been looking for you all day. Are you okay? How did you find your way here?" Emily turned back to look for the dog, her heart swelling with gratitude. But the clearing was empty. The dog was gone. Where did he go?" she murmured, scanning the darkness. The ranger frowned. "Who, sweetheart? Did someone help you?" "The dog," Emily said, her voice trembling. "He brought me here. He saved me." The ranger looked confused, shaking his head. "There's no dog out here, Emily. You must have been imagining things." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but then paused. She knew what she had seen. That dog had been real, its warmth, its strength, the way it had protected her from the shadows. She turned her gaze back toward the forest, where the trees loomed dark and silent. "Thank you," she whispered softly, her voice carried away by the wind. And deep in the forest, unseen by anyone, a pair of amber eyes watched from the shadows before turning and disappearing back into the darkness. Days later, the town was still abuzz with Emily's miraculous return. Newspaper headlines ran with the story, "Lost Girl Found Safe in the Forest." Everyone wanted to know how she had survived and found her way back, but no one could quite believe her tale of the mysterious dog. Emily sat curled up on the couch in her living room as her parents fussed over her, bringing her blankets, snacks, and warm tea. "Are you sure you're okay, sweetheart?" her mom asked for the 100th time. Emily nodded, staring at the window where the trees swayed gently in the distance. "It's not a story, Mom," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "The dog was real. He saved me." Her father smiled gently, exchanging a glance with her mother. "I'm sure he did," he replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Emily frowned. She knew it had happened. The warmth of the dog's fur, the sound of his growl, the way he had stood by her without hesitation, it had been too real to dismiss. She looked out the window again, half hoping to see those amber eyes peering back at her from the edge of the forest. But there was nothing. The days turned into weeks, and Emily's life slowly began to return to normal. But she couldn't stop thinking about the dog. Every evening, she would find herself staring out at the woods, wondering if he was still out there. "Where did you come from?" she would whisper, hoping for some sort of sign. One afternoon, Emily decided she couldn't wait any longer. Pulling on her boots and jacket, she slipped out the back door while her parents were busy. The crisp air filled her lungs as she stepped onto the forest edge, the tall trees rising like silent guardians before her. "I'm coming to find you," she said firmly, her voice small but determined. With careful steps, Emily made her way back into the forest, retracing the path she thought the dog had led her down before. The trees were just as tall, the shadows just as deep, but this time she wasn't afraid. She felt safe, as though the dog's presence still lingered here. "Where are you?" she called softly, her voice carrying through the trees. She paused, listening for any sound, a rustle, a bark, anything. But all she heard was the wind whispering through the branches. Then she saw it. A flash of movement in the distance. Her heart leapt, and she froze, squinting into the shadows. Slowly, the figure emerged, a tall, strong form padding silently across the forest floor. It was him. "Dog?" Emily cried, running toward him. The dog stopped and turned to face her, its amber eyes glowing softly in the dim light. Emily dropped to her knees as he approached, tears streaming down her face. "You're real," she whispered, reaching out to touch his fur. It was just as warm as she remembered, solid and strong beneath her fingertips. The dog sat down, watching her with an almost human understanding. Emily smiled, feeling the connection between them settle deep in her chest. "Why did you help me?" she asked. The dog didn't answer, of course, but somehow she felt like he understood her question. "I want to thank you," she said softly. "You saved my life." The dog tilted its head, as though considering her words. Then, without warning, he stood and turned, walking deeper into the forest. "Wait!" Emily cried, scrambling to her feet. "Where are you going?" The dog paused just long enough to look back at her, his gaze steady. For a moment, Emily thought he might stay. But then he turned again and disappeared into the shadows. Emily stood there for a long time, watching the place where he had vanished. Finally, she wiped her tears and started back toward home, her heart full of gratitude and wonder. Years passed, but Emily never forgot the dog. Even as she grew older, moved away, and started a family of her own, the memory of those amber eyes and that quiet, loyal strength stayed with her. She often told her children the story of how she had been lost in the forest and saved by a dog who seemed more like a guardian spirit than an ordinary animal. And though they marveled at the tale, they would always ask the same question: "What happened to the dog, Mom?" Emily would smile wistfully and shake her head. "I don't know," she would say softly, "but I like to think he's still out there, helping someone else who needs him. And maybe somewhere deep in the forest, a pair of glowing amber eyes still watch over the lost and the frightened, a silent protector who will appear when he's needed most." The days turned into years, but the story of Emily's miraculous return and the mysterious forest dog remained a favorite topic in the small town. Some spoke of the tale as though it were a legend. Children would whisper about the guardian of the woods as they played near the forest edge, daring one another to venture further. Others, especially older folks, would shake their heads and mutter about things in the woods best left undisturbed. But for Emily, the story was no legend. She remembered every detail vividly: the warmth of the dog's fur, the gentleness in its eyes, and the unwavering way it had protected her. It was a part of her life she would carry forever. And as she grew older, the experience became more than a memory. It became a lesson. A reminder that sometimes help comes when you least expect it and from the most surprising places. Emily's connection to the forest never faded. She spent years studying its ecology, learning about the creatures who live there, and volunteering with local wildlife organizations. She even earned a reputation as the forest girl, the one who always knew how to guide lost hikers back to safety or help rehabilitate injured animals. It was as though the bond she had formed with the mysterious dog had opened a door, giving her a deep understanding of the forest and its secrets. One summer afternoon, when Emily was in her early 20s, she decided to revisit the place where she had first met the dog. The forest had changed slightly over the years. The trees were taller, their trunks thicker, and the undergrowth denser, but it still held the same quiet magic she remembered. Birds chirped in a canopy above, and sunlight filtered down in golden beams, illuminating patches of ferns and wildflowers. She made her way carefully through the familiar terrain, pausing now and then to listen to the wind or watch a squirrel dart up a tree. She wasn't in any rush. This visit wasn't about finding answers or reliving the past. It was simply about being here again, about feeling that connection to something ancient and wild. But as Emily walked deeper into the woods, she began to feel the faint sense that she was being watched. It wasn't an unsettling feeling, but rather a familiar one, a sense of quiet company. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze mid-step, turning her head toward the shadows. There, standing just beyond the edge of a sunlit clearing, was a dog. For a moment, Emily's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the same dog, she realized. This one was smaller, younger, and its fur was lighter, a mix of tan and cream. But those eyes were the same amber gold, full of intelligence and something deeper. "Hello," Emily whispered softly, her voice barely audible above the rustling of leaves. The dog tilted its head, watching her closely, but making no move to approach. Emily crouched down slowly, keeping her movements gentle. "It's okay," she said. "I won't hurt you." The dog took a tentative step forward, sniffing the air. Emily stayed still, giving it time to decide. After a moment, the dog came closer, its tail wagging faintly. "You're beautiful," Emily said, a smile spreading across her face. She extended her hand, letting the dog sniff her fingers before gently brushing its fur. The moment felt almost sacred, like history was repeating itself. "Who are you?" Emily whispered. "Did he send you?" The dog's ears perked up, as though it understood. It let out a soft bark before turning and trotting back into the shadows. Emily stood up quickly. "Wait," she called, following after it. The dog led her deeper into the forest, moving with an agility and purpose that reminded her of the guardian she had met so many years ago. Emily kept up as best she could, her heart pounding with anticipation. After what felt like an eternity, the dog slowed, pausing at the edge of another clearing. Emily stepped forward, and her breath caught. There, in the center of the clearing, lay a small stone marker. It was weathered and partially covered in moss, but the inscription was clear. "To the guardian of the woods, a friend to the lost." Emily knelt beside the stone, tears welling in her eyes. She ran her fingers gently over the inscription, her heart swelling with emotion. "It was real," she whispered. "It was all real." The young dog sat beside her, its gaze fixed on a marker as though paying its own quiet respects. Emily smiled through her tears, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying through the clearing. "Thank you for saving me." For the rest of the afternoon, Emily stayed in the clearing, reflecting on her time in the forest and the mysterious dog that had changed her life forever. The young dog stayed with her, keeping her company in silence. When the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trees, Emily finally stood and turned to leave. As she made her way back through the forest, the young dog followed her for a while before eventually stopping at the tree line. Emily turned back, meeting its amber gaze one last time. "Goodbye, guardian," she said. The dog gave a single, quiet bark before disappearing into the woods. Years later, Emily found herself returning to the forest again, this time with her own children. She had told them the story of the guardian dog many times, and now they wanted to see the place for themselves. "Is it really true, Mom?" her youngest asked as they walked through the woods. Emily smiled, glancing down at her child. "It's true," she said softly. "Somewhere out here, there's a guardian watching over those who are lost." They reached the clearing where the stone marker still stood, though it was even more weathered now. Emily knelt beside it, brushing away the moss and leaves. Her children crowded around her, wide-eyed as they read the inscription. "What happened to the dog, Mom?" her eldest asked. Emily looked up at the trees, listening to the wind rustling through the leaves. For a moment, she thought she saw a flash of movement, a hint of fur and glowing amber eyes watching from the shadows. She smiled. "I think he's still here," she said. "And I think he always will be." As they turned to leave, the forest seemed to hum with life around him, as though acknowledging their presence. Emily glanced back one last time, and for just a second, she could have sworn she saw a familiar shape watching from the edge of the clearing. Maybe it was her imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, the guardian of the woods was still out there, keeping watch. As Emily and her children walked back through the dense, sun-dappled forest, the world seemed to hold its breath. The trees whispered secrets as the wind gently rustled the leaves, and rays of sunlight filtered down like golden threads, illuminating patches of moss-covered ground. Emily's youngest child, Sarah, tugged gently at her hand, her voice breaking the spell. "Mom, do you think the guardian will come to us too?" Emily smiled warmly, brushing a stray curl from Sarah's forehead. "The guardian only appears when someone truly needs help, sweetheart. That's what makes it so special." Sarah nodded thoughtfully as her older brother, James, chimed in with his usual curiosity. "But, Mom, how did the dog know you were lost when you were little?" "I mean, how can a dog just know?" Emily paused, kneeling so she was at eye level with her children. "That's the thing about the guardian," she said, her voice soft but full of meaning. "Some say it's just a dog, but others believe it's something more. Maybe it's the spirit of the forest itself, or a protector sent to guide those who are lost. The truth is, no one really knows." James narrowed his eyes, clearly intrigued. "That sounds like a storybook." "Maybe it is," Emily said, smiling as she stood again. "But that doesn't make it any less real." Their journey back to the car was slow and deliberate as the children examined every flower, fallen branch, and faint animal trail they could find. Emily didn't mind. There was something magical about watching them connect with the same forest that had once held so much mystery for her. In the silence between their conversations, Emily's thoughts drifted back to the stone marker, to the guardian of the woods, a friend to the lost. How long had it been there? Who had placed it? And how many others, like her, had encountered the guardian in their hour of need? She had searched for answers for years, speaking to local historians, combing through old records, and even questioning the elderly townsfolk who still remembered the stories. Some believed the guardian had been around for centuries, appearing to lost travelers and children who wandered too far. Others dismissed it as nothing more than folklore, a tale parents told their kids to keep them from straying too deep into the woods. But Emily knew. The dog had been real, and the memory of its presence was as vivid as ever. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest turned dark, Emily's family sat around a small campfire outside their cabin. They had decided to spend the weekend in the woods, hoping to experience more of its beauty. The crackling fire filled the quiet with a soothing rhythm, and the kids snuggled close, listening as Emily told the story once again, the story of how she had been saved. "You were brave, Mom," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the flames. "I think the dog knew you would take care of the forest someday." Emily smiled, feeling a swell of pride in her daughter's words. "Maybe," she replied. "Or maybe it just saw a little girl who needed help." The forest beyond the fire seemed to listen too, its presence comforting yet vast. James suddenly sat up straighter, his gaze fixed on the shadows. "Mom, did you hear that?" Emily turned her head, her senses sharpening. A faint rustling sound echoed through the trees, soft and deliberate, like footsteps. For a split second, her heart quickened. But then the sound stopped, leaving only the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. "It's probably just an animal," Emily said, trying to sound reassuring. "Maybe a deer or a raccoon." James frowned but nodded, settling back down next to the fire. Emily's gaze lingered on the dark tree line for a moment longer. "Is it you?" She wondered silently, remembering those amber eyes. "Are you still watching?" The night passed peacefully, but the memory of the sound lingered. The next morning, Emily woke early, the first rays of dawn spilling into the cabin through the windows. She slipped out quietly, leaving her children still asleep, and stepped outside into the cool, crisp air. The forest was alive with the sound of birdsong and the soft rustling of leaves, as though the world itself was waking up. Feeling an urge she couldn't explain, Emily began walking toward the woods. She didn't have a destination in mind, but her feet seemed to know where to go. The familiar sights and smells of the forest wrapped around her like an old friend, guiding her deeper and deeper into its embrace. After some time, Emily reached a clearing she didn't recognize, one that felt strangely untouched by time. The sunlight poured in through the trees, casting a golden glow across the grass. And there, sitting in the middle of the clearing, was a dog. Emily froze, her breath catching. It wasn't the guardian she had met as a child, but its resemblance was uncanny. This dog was younger, its fur golden and thick, and its amber eyes fixed on her with quiet intensity. "Hello," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The dog tilted its head, watching her with an expression that felt almost knowing. Slowly, it stood and began walking toward her, its movements calm and purposeful. Emily sank to her knees as the dog stopped just in front of her, its gaze never wavering. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two souls connected by something unspoken. Emily reached out a hand, and the dog leaned forward, pressing its head gently against her palm. A tear slipped down Emily's cheek as a wave of emotion washed over her. "Thank you," she whispered. The dog let out a soft whine, almost as if it understood. Then, with one last glance, it turned and trotted back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. Emily stayed there for a long time, staring after it, her heart full. When she returned to the cabin, her children were awake, playing quietly outside. Sarah ran up to her, a bright smile on her face. "Mom, where did you go?" "Just for a walk," Emily said, ruffling Sarah's hair. "Did you find anything?" James asked, joining them with his usual curiosity. Emily looked back toward the forest, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Yes," she said. "I think I did." Later that day, as they packed up to leave, Emily took one last look at the forest. The guardian, whether real, mythical, or something in between, had changed her life. And now she knew it was still out there, watching over those who needed it most. As their car pulled away, Emily whispered a silent promise to the woods she loved so dearly. "I'll keep telling your story," she said. "I'll make sure no one forgets." And somewhere, deep in the forest, a pair of amber eyes watched, glowing softly in the shadows. Life returned to normal for Emily and her family, but Max became more than just a hero. He became part of their family, their protector, and an inseparable companion. Emily, now safe in her home, never forgot how the German Shepherd had guided her through the forest. But Max's story didn't end with saving her. It only began. In the weeks that followed, Max quickly adapted to his new life. He explored every corner of the family's home with curiosity, as if mapping out every hiding place and room for his own invisible mission. In the mornings, he trotted to the edge of the yard, watching the forest line as though keeping watch over something only he could sense. The family would joke that Max was the guardian of the woods, but Emily always believed there was more to him, a purpose, a quiet mission only he understood. At night, Max lay curled by Emily's bed, his head resting near her hand. She would often fall asleep with her fingers buried in his fur, the rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing soothing her to sleep. In her dreams, the forest no longer frightened her. Instead, she pictured Max leading her through fields of light, with the trees no longer shadowy and foreboding, but bright and golden. One day, as the seasons began to shift, Emily's father decided to repair their old cabin deeper in the woods. "It's been abandoned for years," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans, "but it's time we make it livable again. Maybe we can spend more weekends out there, right, kiddo?" Emily's face lit up at the idea of camping trips with her family. "And with Max, can Max come too?" she asked, tugging on her father's sleeve. "Of course. He's the forest's guardian, after all," her father replied with a wink. When they arrived at the cabin, Max's behavior changed. The moment they opened the creaky wooden door, he bolted inside as though he already knew every corner. His nose sniffed the air, his ears perked, and he paused in front of an old stone fireplace, where the bricks had crumbled with age. Emily watched him curiously. "What's there, Max?" He barked once, softly, then lay down with his head on his paws as though waiting for something, or someone. Her father shrugged. "Dogs are funny that way. Maybe he smells a mouse." But Emily wasn't so sure. As weeks turned into months, Max grew older. His fur began to gray around his muzzle, and his pace slowed on their daily walks. Emily noticed the change first. "Daddy," she whispered one night, "Max doesn't run like he used to. Is he okay?" Her father's expression softened. "He's just getting older, sweetheart. That's what happens to all good dogs. But don't worry, Max isn't going anywhere." Emily hugged Max tightly that night, whispering promises into his ear. "You're my hero, Max. I'll always take care of you." The bond between them only grew stronger. Max would wait by the door when Emily left for school, his ears twitching at the sound of the bus rumbling down the road. When she returned, he would greet her with a wagging tail, his amber eyes lighting up with joy. The two were inseparable, sharing every moment together, from playing in the yard to curling up by the fire on cold winter nights. Years passed, and Emily grew older. Her legs grew longer, her voice deeper, but Max remained constant, a silent protector, always watching. But time, as it does, caught up with him. One day, when Emily was 16, she noticed that Max wasn't waiting at the door when she came home from school. Her heart sank, and she ran through the house, calling his name. "Max? Max, where are you?" She found him lying on the porch, his body still, but his eyes watching the forest. He looked up when she knelt beside him, and he let out a soft, low whine. "Max." Her voice trembled. "What's wrong?" Her father appeared behind her, his face grave. "He's tired, Emily. He's been holding on for a long time for you." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, he can't. He can't go. Not yet." Her father placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes we have to let them rest, sweetheart. Max has done his job. He's protected you all these years. He deserves peace now." But Emily wasn't ready. "Come on, Max. Let's go for a walk. You love the forest, right? Just one more walk, okay?" Max lifted his head slowly, his tail thumping weakly against the porch. Emily smiled through her tears. "That's my boy. Come on." Her father helped her as they led Max into the woods, his steps slow but determined. Emily held his leash loosely, letting him lead the way. They walked the familiar paths, the same ones where he had once saved her life. The forest was quiet, the golden afternoon light filtering through the trees like a warm embrace. Max stopped suddenly in a small clearing. Emily recognized it immediately. It was the spot where she had first met him all those years ago. Max lowered himself to the ground with a soft groan, his body curling slightly as if he were resting. Emily knelt beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "Do you remember this place, Max?" she whispered. "You saved me here. You were my hero." Max's amber eyes looked into hers, filled with a quiet understanding. His breathing slowed, and for a moment, it was as though the forest held its breath with her. Emily pressed her forehead against his. "I love you, Max. I'll never forget you." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint sound of leaves rustling. Emily sat with him for what felt like hours, her tears soaking into his fur. When she finally looked up, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Her father approached silently, his face lined with sorrow. "Come on, sweetheart. It's time to go." Emily shook her head. "Not yet. Just a little longer." Her father nodded and stepped back, giving her the space she needed. As the light faded, Emily swore she felt something, like a presence warm and familiar. The wind picked up again, swirling through the clearing. And in that moment, she knew Max would never truly leave her. Years later, Emily would return to that same spot, a small headstone marking where Max lay. She'd sit in the clearing, the sunlight streaming through the trees, and tell her children the story of the brave German shepherd who saved her life. "He wasn't just a dog," she'd say, her voice full of emotion. "He was my guardian, my hero." Her children would listen with wide eyes, imagining the dog that had been more than just a pet. He had been a protector, a friend, and a symbol of unwavering love. And as Emily stood in the clearing, the wind would whisper through the trees, carrying with it the memory of Max, the guardian of the forest, the hero who would live on forever in her heart. Because some bonds are eternal. And even when our loved ones are no longer with us, their love never truly leaves. Max had saved her once, and in a way, he had saved her every day since.